Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum ji. We are studying clustering as a machine learning technique to carry out unsupervised learning. When we studied different aspects of clustering, we broadly categorized clustering into two types, partition clustering and hierarchical clustering. In the previous video, we talked about partition clustering with an emphasis on k-means clustering. We studied algorithmic implementation of k-means clustering, its computational complexity, and what are the limitations associated with k-means clustering. Today, we will study hierarchical clustering with a focus on agglomerative clustering, that is one type of hierarchical clustering. And before I formally define hierarchy clustering, I will start with an illustration and we will build on this illustration to explain hierarchy clustering or agglomerative clustering. Okay, let me begin with the illustration. Say we have these 6 data points. So in hierarchy clustering, we begin with a base case. As the name suggests, we want to build some hierarchy. So we start with a base case and we assume that we treat each point as a cluster. So we have 6 data points and I will be treating all of these 6 data points as individual clusters. The idea is I want to group these together to define clusters, and I will be using the distance metric to quantify similarity between data points, similarity between clusters. We will formally define it, but here this is just a very a broad level introduction or an illustration to explain the concepts which we will study later. Okay. So in hierarchical clustering, we often use, most of the times we use this representation of our clustering or our clusters, and this is known as a dendrogram. Let me explain this. So here, if you see the bottom dendrogram, I have indicated x1, x2, x3, x4, x5, x6. So as I move upwards from this base case or the ground level, in fact, this is the highest level. So we have these points as individual clusters. Right? If I ask you that if you group the items, the points which are closer to each other in the form of clusters, how would you cluster? Obviously, first you would say, if I ask you to have 4 clusters, so you would naturally group x1 and x2, you may group x3 and x4, you would treat x5 as one cluster, and you may treat x6 as one cluster. Right? This is in fact we are doing when we are moving from this bottom of the dendrogram upwards. Right? Say if I am at this level in the dendrogram, so x1 and x2 would merge to form a cluster, x3 and x4 merge to form a cluster, and x5 as an individual cluster, and x6 as an individual cluster. So a dendrogram is a tree-like data structure that is recording, or that is keeping a record of merging of different clusters as we go from bottom to top. Right? Okay. At this level, at this blue level, we have these 6 clusters, right? If I go one level up, let's say at this level, so now x1 and x2 would be, I would like to merge x1 and x2. I will merge x3 and x4. x5 is a separate cluster, x is a separate cluster. At this blue level, we have 6 clusters, individual points. But at this green level, so we have merged the data points, we have merged the clusters at the previous level to form new clusters. So this is illustrated in this figure. So at this green level, we have 4 clusters. If I take a level up, say at this level, we'll have 3 clusters. right? So see, at this level, this horizontal line is cutting the dendrogram at 3 points. So 1 point, 2 point, and this is the third point. Right? So the first point corresponds to one cluster, and it has, if you go towards all the leaves, so we have x1 and x2 in this cluster. If you traverse this, you will have x3 and x4 and x5 as one cluster and x6 as individual clusters. If I further go to this level, upwards, so I would have two clusters because this yellow line is intersecting dendrogram at 2 points. And the first cluster is x1, x2, x3, x4, x5, and second cluster only x6. So you only have two clusters. Or we can say we take a union of clusters at level I plus 1 to obtain a parent cluster at level I. So this top of the tree is, I would refer to as a root. So root corresponds to one cluster and leaf represents individual clusters. At this yellow level, we have two leaves. Right? And similarly, at the blue level, we have all the points as individual clusters, we have 6 leaves. Maybe before I move further, maybe I can also explain the height of this dendrogram, the height of each leaf. So the height of the lowest internal node. So for example, the height of this is would be quantifying the distance between x4 and x3. This is equivalent to that you have 2 points x3 and x4, and you start moving outwards. Out of you zoom out of x3, you zoom out of x4. Right. So you draw a circle, a boundary, circle boundary outside x3 and outside x4, and as soon the boundary of x3 would capture x4. So this the height of this dendrogram, the height of this node would be representing the closeness of x3 and x4. Right. Okay, I assume you're clear with this illustration that how are we forming different clusters, how are we forming clusters at different levels, right? So from the data representation, we have the dendrogram, and when we cut dendrogram at different levels, we obtain different clusters. Right? We could split into 2 clusters, we could split into 3 clusters, 4 clusters, or if we treat all the points as individual clusters, we obtain 6 clusters. Right? So building on this illustration, we can define hierarchical clustering. So in hierarchical clustering, we carry out a hierarchical decomposition of the data points using some criteria. In the previous example, we were merging the closest clusters, the closest points as we traverse from the individual clusters to one cluster that has all the points. We use distance or similarity metric to carry out hierarchical decomposition on dendrogram. We do not need to define. We do not need to define the number of clusters as an input when we carry out hierarchical clustering. A related sequence of clusters is created in this decomposition process. So we have these nested clusters. We have a sequence of nested clusters. So we had one cluster. Instead of one cluster, we had 2 clusters, and so on and so forth. So we have when we carry out hierarchical clustering, we obtain a nested sequence of clusters. And we saw that we could represent this nested sequence in the form of a tree, and we call the tree as dendrogram. Let me also explain dendrogram formally. It's a tree data structure that records the sequences of splits or merges. It is used for visualization of hierarchical clustering techniques. So if you zoom into one node of this dendrogram, so where we have a split, we call this as root. And this individual, if you don't have a further splitting, we refer to it as a leaf. This is an internal node because here we are having a further split into two leaves. So this is a terminal branch because we're not further splitting this, and this is the internal branch. We represent the similarity between two data points in the dendrogram as the height of the lowest internal node they share. And root corresponds to one cluster, and once we keep on dividing, we keep on decomposing, we keep on decomposing the tree by further traversing down from the root node. We obtain leaves, and each leaf represents individual clusters. Right? So each level of the tree shows clusters for that level, as we saw in the illustration. Okay, so we using the illustration, we understood the concept, and then we're building on the illustration. We have formally defined hierarchical clustering. So in nutshell, we can say that we had these data points, and from these data points, we could obtain a dendrogram, and using this dendrogram, by cutting this dendrogram at different levels, we obtain these nested clusters. If we made a split at this blue level, so this horizontal line, so it is cutting dendrogram at 6 points. So you have six clusters. If we have six data points, so these six clusters correspond to six individual points, because this blue line is cutting all the leaves, right? So this green line is splitting the dendrogram at 4 points, right? And among these 4 points, so this last one corresponds to leaf, x5 corresponds to leaf, and this is internal branch. This is also internal branch. So these two internal branches contains 2 points each, and x5 and x6 are the leaves. We have individual clusters. Right? So that's how we carry out hierarchical clustering. So dendrogram is a representation of nested clusters. We can cut the dendrogram at a desired level to carry out clustering. The connected data points below the desired level form a cluster. For example, at this yellow level, so we have x1, x2, x3, x4, x5 would represent one cluster. And we have seen this earlier, right? I hope this is clear. We divide hierarchy clustering into two types: agglomerative clustering, in which we start with considering each data point as one cluster, as we did in one example. And then we merge the clusters iteratively. We keep on merging until all clusters are fused to form one cluster uh, that contains all the data points. Agglomerative clustering, as the name suggests, is also termed as a bottom-up approach, because you start with the six clusters, all the data points as individual clusters, and then you keep on merging iteratively, right? So this is agglomerative clustering. And the example we did was of agglomerative clustering. The next type is divisive clustering. As the name suggests, you start with considering all data points as a single cluster, and we keep on splitting the clusters iteratively, successively. And this is termed as top-down. In both approaches, we use distance metric or similarity metric, uh, one cluster at a time. So we keep on merging iteratively. We keep on merging the clusters iteratively, successively. Among these two techniques, agglomerative is more popular than divisive methods. And the illustration we have just seen is an example of agglomerative clustering. So let me define the algorithm formally for agglomerative clustering. So we carry out the following steps. If you have these n data points we want to cluster, where each data point has an in a d-dimensional feature space, we use the following algorithm to carry out agglomerative clustering. To start, you make each data point as a cluster. And then we compare all pairwise distances, right? And we compute these pairwise distances and store them in the form of proximity matrix. And that is storing distance from point 1 to point 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 4, similarly 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and so on and so forth. Right? So it stores all pairwise distances in the form of matrix. Right? So once we have computed these distances, we repeat the following steps. We merge the two clusters that are nearest to each other to form a cluster C. So we merge the clusters that are nearest to each other to form a new cluster C. And next, we compute the distance of C from all other clusters. And we keep on merging clusters until only one cluster is left. This is a very simple technique, a method which we call agglomerative clustering. The computation complexity to carry out agglomerative clustering is of the order. If I ask you, where is the most computation expensive step in the algorithm? Computing distances, right? And before this for loop, before merging of clusters, we are carrying out all pairwise distances. If you have n data points, the complexity to compute distances of each point, every other point, would be n squared times d, where d is the dimension of the feature space. And due to this high computation complexity, we often say that hierarchy clustering techniques do not scale well with the size of the data, because when n grows, the complexity grows as n squared. Right? Okay. In agglomerative clustering, we are merging the two clusters that are nearest to each other. And we know that a group of points represents a cluster. We have studied a distance metric that computes the distance between points. So we know how to measure the distance between the 2 points, but defining the distance between a point and a cluster, or defining distance between two clusters, is non-obvious. If you have 2 points, you can compute distance. You can use Manhattan norm, you can use one norm, you can use Euclidean norm, you can use Chebyshev norm. Right? But defining distance between a point and a group of points, defining distance between two groups of points, is non-obvious. And this, we ask a question: how do we compute the distance between a point and a cluster, or distance between two clusters? And the answer to this question is, we can define the closest pair of clusters in multiple ways. And due to these multiple ways, we can have different versions of hierarchical clustering. So these different ways include single linkage, that if you have two clusters, you define the closeness between two clusters as a distance of two closest data points in the different clusters. And this is also termed as nearest neighbor. Right? So you're finding a nearest neighbor of for each point in the cluster in the neighboring cluster. Similarly, we can define a furthest neighbor, which is complete linkage, distance of the furthest points in the different clusters. So if you have two clusters, we want to compute the distance between these two clusters. We define distance as the furthest distance, the distance of the furthest points in these two clusters. We can also define group average linkage. So average distance between all pairs of points in the two different clusters. Right? So let me explain this. So you have two clusters, right? You pick one point from one cluster and compute distance of this point from every other point in this cluster. And you do the same for every point in this cluster. and then you take average of all these distances, that is group average linkage. We can simplify things and we can also define centroid linkage. So you compute centroid of this cluster, centroid of second cluster, and simply distance between the two centroids would be a measure of closeness of these two clusters. And finally, another method is Ward's linkage, that in which we merge the clusters such that the variance of the merged clusters is minimized. Is minimized. So you have two clusters. So you would choose to merge these two clusters. You would say that this cluster is nearest to this cluster if, when you combine these two clusters, the variance SSE, sum of squared error, is minimized for this merged cluster. Right? Maybe I can explain very briefly the single linkage and complete linkage, and what's the difference between these two. In single linkage, as I explained earlier, we have distance between the two clusters as the distance between the closest data points, nearest neighbor. So if you have two clusters CL and CM, we can define the single linkage distance as you take a minimum of distance between xi, xj, where xi belongs to cluster CL and xj belongs to CM. If I illustrate this, say you have these two clusters, CL and CM, we can define the single linkage distance between two clusters as the distance between the closest points, which is given by this line. Right? The distance between these 2 points is the single linkage distance. So if we use single linkage to carry out agglomerative clustering, we obtain the clusters which are long and thin, because we are using the points which are closest to each other in merging clusters. And due to chaining effect, we can have long and thin clusters. And this linkage technique is sensitive to noise or outliers, because if you have one outlier, you might be using that to link to the next cluster, and that point could be an outlier or could be disturbed from the rest of the points due to noise. We can have complete linkage. Distance between the two clusters is the distance between the furthest closest data points. And in this case, we can define distance between cluster CL and CM as we take a maximum over the distance between any pair of points in the clusters, the two clusters respectively. So visually, we can define this green line to denote this complete linkage distance. If we use complete linkage, we obtain more compact clusters, spherical clusters, or globular shaped or blob type clusters. And complete linkage is less sensitive to noise or outliers. Let me illustrate this with the help of one example. Say if I give you these points, and if we use single linkage to form nested clusters. So and in the base case, we treat all of these points as individual clusters. Okay. If we take one level up in the dendrogram, we can merge points. So natural merging would be that you merge these two. Similarly, you merge these 3 pair of points. If you go further level up, and if we're using single linkage, so for example, if I want to carry out merger, if I want to merge this cluster with this neighboring cluster, and if I'm using single linkage, which cluster is closest? So this distance is the single linkage distance for these two clusters, and this distance is the single linkage distance between these two clusters. Obviously, you would merge these two clusters. Similarly, we merge these two clusters. And finally, we obtain the single cluster containing all the points. Alternatively, if we use complete linkage for these points, in the first level, obviously, we'll be merging in a similar way. But next, if I use furthest closest points, so this is the distance between these two clusters, and this is the distance between these two clusters. So the closest cluster for this cluster would be this one. That's how, that's why we merge these two clusters. And similarly, we merge these two clusters. And finally, you obtain a single cluster. And this is just an illustration of the single linkage versus complete linkage. Okay, with this, we can present a summary of hierarchy clustering. In hierarchy clustering, we obtain a set of nested clusters we arrange as a tree, which is also known as a dendrogram. We do not need to specify the number of clusters in advance. We can cut the dendrogram at a desired level to obtain different numbers of clusters. And we have two types. Agglomerative is bottom up and divisive is top down. And we have different metrics to quantify the distance between the clusters. And obviously, if you use single linkage or complete linkage or centroid linkage, you would obtain different nested clusters, or you can say the clusters are different for each of the distance metric. Hierarchy clustering is often used for analyzing text data or social network data because we can naturally combine, and that clustering would give us a more intuitive sense of clustering when we combine the social network data or when we combine a text data to form clusters. Unlike k-means, hierarchy clustering is computation intensive. It does not scale well due to significant computational cost, which is of the order n square. I have dropped d here because d is often less than, much smaller than n. Like any heuristic search algorithm, in hierarchy clustering, local optimum point can be a problem. The clustering may converge to local optimum instead of global optimum. Interpretation of results in hierarchy clustering is very, very subjective. And as I said earlier, when we analyze text data or social network data, that subjective interpretation would make more sense. Right, with this, we conclude our clustering topic. We have studied partition clustering and we have studied hierarchy clustering. Should you need to study in more detail, I suggest you to refer to these references. I encourage you to study expectation maximization clustering technique, because k-means is a special variant of expectation maximization, and expectation maximization covers a broad range of clustering techniques.